We are now live.
या साथियों, जनता पार्लियामेंट कल से शुरू हो चुकी है और आज हम शिक्षा के मुद्दे पर बात करने वाले हैं। इस सत्र में शिक्षा पर चर्चा होगी और इस सत्र की अध्यक्षता प्रोफेसर शांता सिन्हा, फॉर्मर चेयरमैन एनसीपीसीआर करेंगी और इस सत्र में बहुत सारे हमारे विद्वान वक्ता अपनी बात रखेंगे और कुछ रिजोल्यूशंस भी हम लोग पारित करेंगे। तो मैं सबसे पहले शांता जी को आमंत्रित करता हूं कि वो सदन की कार्यवाही चलाने की इजाजत दें और अपने इनॉग्रल भाषण से इसकी शुरुआत करें।
सभी को नमस्कार। द हाउस इज इन सेशन। सदन की कार्यवाही शुरू करी जाती है। We are meeting on as a Janta Parliament in very unusual times, and I think we should have met much earlier, especially due to the emergency that there is today due to the lockdown. Let me start by stating that all of us who have gathered here have faith in democracy in India. Otherwise, we wouldn't have conducted the Janta Parliament. Perhaps we have more faith in the system than the system has in itself. We're all here to listen to the voices of children, and we hope that the voice of children becomes the voice of the Parliament and India's democracy. We are here to examine the status of 42% of India's population during lockdown and the nature of state action, especially with reference to right to education. I must say that violations of children's rights have occurred even during normal times, with hundreds and thousands of children who remain uncovered. Our country has a dubious distinction of having the largest number of malnourished children in the world. So we claim that we have 99% of children enrolled in schools. We have 62 million children in the 6 to 18 years who are not attending schools. This is what the new education policy has told us. Children have been exploited, sexually abused, trafficked, and left without protection. While this is the status of children, before COVID, I must say that during lockdown, this situation has got aggravated, and at multiple levels, it has grown bigger and bigger. Now, let me tell you, as all of you know, how we are witness at every step to the harm caused to children due to COVID. The lockdown has affected all ages of children, cutting across regions, communities, and especially among the poor, marginalized, Dalit, Adivasi, OBCs, and minority communities. The worst affected are children of daily wage earners and casual workers who have no work, livelihood, and earnings, having no reserves of food, with children going hungry and having barely one meal a day. We must think of all the stories that we've read in the newspapers about girls, about children with special needs, about children who walk miles and miles. In fact, we are witness to heart-wrenching stories of migrant workers with their infants and children, youth workers who were left without any option but to walk hundreds of kilometers, tired and thirsty, suffering from bodily pain, experiencing fatigue and exhaustion. They have just not been counted for and not part of any data, either during COVID or even before COVID. We are witness to how employers of children and the middlemen just abandoned children at workplaces and left them to their fate without food, shelter, and any form of protection. I often wonder where the Child Labor Protection and Regulation Act was, and why was it that these children were even in these sweatshops working like small machines. They should not have been there at all. They should have been enjoying their right to education. We are indeed with
birthday, so we all wish him happy birthday.
Yeah, many happy returns, actually.
Thank you, sir.
What happened? Where is? Okay, yeah, he got disconnected. Yes.
Sorry, I don't know why it got disconnected suddenly. So Akhil, I was saying today is Akhil's birthday, so you all wish him happy birthday and a good year ahead.
Thank you, sir.
And I welcome you all to this annual important budget discussion that we hold every year. But of course, for the last 2 years, we are holding it in a very special situation, one that we are holding online. And that also makes the situation is very different, situation is abnormal. And this is the context in which the budget, I guess, have to be also evaluated. That we are not in a new normal situation. The economy is not normal. The social situation is not normal. And of course, we are going through the most difficult phase, of our independent history, I guess. Many people believe that. The current year, we have seen a reasonably good recovery. GDP has been gone up, but this is with respect to a low base, so there is hardly any cause for celebration. Now, in the next year, we would not have this luxury of low base. So obviously, the stimulants, the growth stimulants have to be very, very good and effective. Otherwise, maintaining this 8-9% growth would be difficult. That is one aspect. So the budget has to be growth stimulating. Second aspect is that we all know that over the last couple of years, the inequality has also gone up substantially. Now, coupled with that, the fact that our GDP remains the same as it used to be a couple of years back, and inequality has increased. That means a lot of people have, gone down substantially in their income level and, of course, their consumption level. So, along with being growth stimulant, we have to give, if you say, healing touch to suffering people. People are still suffering. Now, the budget has to be evaluated from, these two, criteria, whether you are living up to those two expectations. It is, of course, one, I would appreciate the finance minister that she has at least, avoided the temptation of being fiscally prudent, which is the buzzword now. I would not say she has dumped the goal, but she has not gone too far with fiscal prudence. And that's where I think, we have debated a bit from the so-called neoliberal agenda, which swept the world for 2-3 decades, but which have taken a backseat now. All countries, developed countries, are also dumping it, and they are accepting bigger government role and fiscal management, not just about fiscal prudence. So there has not been a strong effort to reduce fiscal deficit, which I think is the need of the hour. This is not the time to go for that consolidation. We can tolerate a bit of fiscal profligacy at this juncture, considering the economic situation. Second thing is that the budget has given huge emphasis on infrastructure, which again is not a bad idea. we all know that India has infrastructure deficit, which has been affecting our competitiveness. So, taking that as an important agenda is good. But will that really make huge impact in terms of stimulating growth? That still remains a question. Even though, as I said, infrastructure development is a good idea, the social impact of that might not be that equal, because these days infrastructure is built with a lot of capital and less of labor. Secondly, a part of that would be requiring import consumption. So the demand created by these infrastructure projects will be linked to foreign countries. So there would be some risk of that. So given this, what I found a bit surprising that MG Narega allocation did not go up. In fact, it got reduced substantially. If you look at the current year revised estimate, not the allocation. Now we know current year revised allocation had to go up because government was keen that those who went for reverse migration to villages, they need this, social assistance. So government actually increased much more than what was budgeted initially. So that, of course, that step of the government should be appreciated. But the question is, has that need gone over now? We still have, problem of employment or not? Now, if we still have that problem of employment, especially in rural areas, then possibly it would have been better to, increase allocation or at least keep at the same level, of this current year. Second aspect, I also saw that, we have Professor Saxena who might touch upon this, and even Professor Mahajan. Agriculture sector, many experts believe, has not been given due attention. Although some infrastructure scheme within agriculture have been taken up, and some budget restructuring of the schemes have been taken up, but will that be enough? And of course, we have seen that fertilizer subsidy has also gone down. Now, when fertilizer subsidy has gone down and other ways of assisting the agriculture has not been taken up, this can work as a dampener to agriculture. You might have good objective of reducing subsidy and assisting agriculture through other means, but that's not very clear. Secondly, I also see a budget cut in procurement and food subsidy, which also indirectly affect the agriculture and the rural economy at large. Then the budget also talked about long-term priorities, and finance minister talked about Amrit Kalam. That is fine. We should have long-term objective, long-term strategies in mind. But we had been going through Rahu Kalam. Have we been out of that by now? If not, then the short-term situation also and the short-term measures also probably needed better attention. Second thing is that this is not the first time finance minister has been emphasizing long-term strategies and long-term objectives. But some experts have also said that the long-term strategies that we are talking this year, are they consistent with the long-term strategies we talked 1 year back or 2 years back? And also, if we keep on changing our long-term strategies every year, then also you might have some problems. And of course, CSD is always keen that social sector budget allocation improves and there are good utilization. and that means education, health. These are also important priorities. And by now we all know that only physical infrastructure cannot ensure development of a country. Not even growth, not just not development, but even growth does not occur. Growth and development are of course different, but even growth does not occur unless you take adequate care of education and health sector. And we have seen that our health sector infrastructure is, grossly inadequate. Our COVID, pandemic has shown that, and we have seen, it became clear two aspects that our infrastructure is poor. For example, we have just 5 hospital beds for 10,000 population, which is lower than even Bangladesh. Forget about countries like Vietnam. More importantly, where in Vietnam there are about 30 hospitals bed for 10,000 population, and almost all are in public sector. In our case, more than half are in actually private sector. And in Vietnam, they have, of course, very vibrant private sector healthcare, but that's largely confined to tertiary healthcare. In India, we have got private everywhere, primary to tertiary everywhere, and primary healthcare of private sector mostly kind of informal, no control on quality of care and all those things. So this creates a huge problem for us. Secondly, education also, we have seen the problems, and last 2 years education being off from the government or even our public agenda. It needs better attention, but has that got the due attention that it deserves? These are important questions. Those need to be discussed. And another aspect of this budget was huge emphasis on digitalization. But we have also seen that digital education has touched only about 10% of the population. 90% people could not access it due to their own problems. So that means people are not ready for, overwhelming section of our population are not ready for this kind of digital push. So given that, would it be fair and equitable to give so much of digital push? And physical infrastructures in schools should be ignored. And we all know that, children is not about, children education is not about giving them some lessons. It's also about making them socially oriented, making them socially, capable. So that would not happen online, So especially school education, digital push might not be a good idea in my view. So I would like to hear first. Another aspect I found, Finance Minister gave good emphasis that river interlinking project. Now, the river projects that we have, whether it is Vakra Nangal or in South India or Damodar Valley corporations, are they working to the level they were expected or they were planned, or they created unintended consequences, that can be political. States are fighting with each other, communities are fighting with each other. That's a political problem, social problem. Then we see the status of Jamuna River. The river is dead. So by interlinking, will we kill some rivers? These are important agenda, important questions which are not yet debated, discussed thoroughly in the country. Now, without that, taking up such big ticket projects, are they, good enough? Should we accept, adopt such projects? I have some question mark on that. So to discuss all this, we have few eminent experts. Professor Dubey, who was supposed to chair this session, he has joined, but did not respond. But good morning and welcome you, sir. To chair this session, we have Professor Biswajit Dhar, who kindly agreed to chair at the last moment. So we are thankful to him. Professor Dhar is professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, other in many important positions like DG RIS, and he is also vice president of Csd governing body. We also have Professor Atul Sharma, who is an eminent economist.
I request everyone to please stop this side talk. I mean, please refrain from it and mute yourself. I mean, it disturbs the speakers. Thank you.
So apart from being a professor in prestigious ISI, Indian Statistical Institute, and vice chancellor at Rajiv Gandhi University, Itanagar, he also was in Finance Commission, and so his understanding of these issues are very good. So we have Professor Atul Sharma, we have Professor Ashwini Mahajan, who apart from being a professor is also convener of Swadeshi Jagran Manch, and where people think that Swadeshi Jagran Manch is a bit sympathetic to the government, but I have seen Professor Mahajan being absolutely critical of government policies and budgets, whatever he thinks that it deserves. So we welcome Professor Mahajan, and he has been joining us for several years. We have Professor Indranil Mukhopadhyay, who is teaching at Jindal Global University, and he is relatively young, and so we have young blood also in this discussion, and it's good to hear from young people also, because Finance Minister is talking about 25 years horizon. Some of us probably would not be there to see those days, but hope Professor Mukherjee and others will stay. So hearing their viewpoints would be important. And of course, we have Professor K.V. Saxena, who has held important positions in government, including in Planning Commission. Currently, he is distinguished professor at CSD and contributing to CSD activities on agriculture and social inclusion issues. So he will also have his observations on the budget. With that, I will hand over the floor to Professor Biswajit Dhar to chair the session. Professor Biswajit Dhar, thank you, and please take it over.
Thank you, Professor Nityanand and Nathananda, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you as usual. And I've been joining this event for a number of years, and I'd also like to greet Professor Muchkund Dubey. I'm feeling very uncomfortable occupying his seat in this discussion. Of course, not to speak of the wonderful initial thoughts that he always gives, and which help us in sort of directing the discussion in this very important event that CSD organizes. I really hope, sir, you get well soon, and speedy recovery, sir. And I hope that at some point you'll be able to speak and give us your considered views, and we're really looking forward to that. So, so what I will do is that I'll make some initial comments on the budget, and then give the floor to the esteemed colleagues who are in the panel, and finally, in the summing up, I'll say a few more things based on what the inputs are from all our fellow panelists. Now, I think Professor Nityananda has given a very good overview, I would say, of the budget And the whole I think the struggle between the long term and the short term, which we see in the budget, that there is a long term perspective, and whenever one looks at the long term and that kind of a long term, then one is of course reminded of Keynes's very famous quip that in the long run we are all dead. And so that is one issue that we need to sort of look at. And of course, he pointed to the numerous short-term issues, the struggle that the Indian economy has been facing, just not in the past 2 years. And that's the important part that he also mentioned. That we have been actually, even before the pandemic struck us, we had been on a downturn. And so really, if you look at, so it's very important to see what your pre-COVID sort of reference point is. So if your pre-COVID reference point is 1920, then, as economists, we always say that this is not a normal year. So we shouldn't actually compare what's going on today with 1920, because 1920 was not a normal year. We all know what the growth, what kind of growth was registered in 1920. Initially, we heard that the growth was in excess of 4%. Last year, it was revised down to 4% exactly. And in the estimates that the NSO provided a day before the budget was presented, we heard that in 1920 the Indian economy grew by 3.7%. So if you look at the growth trends, there's been a sharp decline from something about 6.8% in 17-18 down to 3.7% in 1920. So obviously, this comparison with 1920 is not correct. If you expect the Indian economy to perform as it did earlier, when the expectations was that the economy will grow by at least 7%. This is what Mr. Arun Jaitley used to constantly remind us, that we have to grow by at least 7%. And the target was that Indian economy should become a 5 trillion economy in those days, in 5 years, and 10 trillion economy in 10 years. So the point I'm making is that you really can't achieve those 5 trillion and $10 trillion targets in quick time. You have to again wait for at least the medium term. If suppose we get stuck at this level of growth, the low growth trajectory. Now, what's holding us back? So quite obviously there are pain points, and we know that recovery has been extremely uneven. Nitya pointed this out. Except agriculture, which has been growing steadily, it has been, which is quite remarkable, given the performance of Indian agriculture in the past. And so the good rainfall that we have been having consistently for the past few years have helped the sector. And despite the disruption that we saw for more than a year, agriculture has registered steady growth. But that's not the case with manufacturing, and manufacturing has been, at best registering a choppy growth, especially in the last few months for which we have the data. So I was looking at the data for the IIP for November, which is the last set of numbers we have, November 21. And in November 21, the manufacturing sector grew by less than 1%. So there are issues there. We still don't know what is the situation of the MSME sector, especially the micro sector, the informal sector, we still don't have any idea. And why I say this is that this is the sector which was affected the most. The disruption was the most in the MSME sector. The job losses were the highest here. And we still don't know what is the situation. All that we know is that because of the disruptions in the labor market that we have, the domestic demand, consumption demand hasn't actually recovered. And this is an admission that has been made even in the economic survey, that consumption demand, which is actually the driver of the Indian economy, has remained subdued. And again, this is vis-a-vis the 1920. So again, we are looking at a low base period where so that again, as I said earlier, that comparison with a less than normal year is not quite appropriate. See, why I'm repeating this thing, because I think we expect the economy to do much better, and for the betterment of the citizens of this country, the economy has to do much better. So we shouldn't be satisfied with these kinds of numbers that we are seeing today. One set of numbers that I see regularly, and it's gives a fair indicator as to where the citizens of this country are, or the perception of the citizens of this country regarding the economy, is the bi-monthly consumer confidence survey that RBI publishes. And the latest set of numbers were published last month in January. And so these relate to the survey done in December 2021. And here again, we see that, the perception among the public, those who have been sort of the respondents, isn't showing, good kind of results. So for instance, the perceptions and expectations on the general economic situation in January 21. So this is January 21 numbers. The survey was for December. It says that 72.2% of the respondents have said that the general economic situation has actually worsened. And in May 20, in the height of the pandemic, May, July, the percentage was about 74 to 77%. So from 77, you have improved to 72. So you don't see a perceptible jump in the way the consumers are viewing the present situation. Similarly, on the expectations of employment, 75% of the people say that it is worsened. And again, in July 2020, this number was 78%. So, like I was saying that, the labor market disruption is getting clearly reflected in these numbers. And similarly, everyone is like, most people, 89% people expect that prices are going to be rising. There'll be higher prices. And on the expectations of income, about 61% people are saying that this is actually income has actually decreased. So we get an idea from these numbers that the present situation is not really something that we can say that we have completely recovered from the crisis. And now this perception is important. I think for the government to recognize that we are still not out of the crisis is important, because then the measures that the government takes, and especially the fiscal policy incentives that the government takes, would be in keeping with what the actual situation of the country is at this point in time. And there I feel that there has been a certain amount of a gap between what we think, many of us think, and what possibly, the finance minister's budget has reflected. I think the finance minister budget reflects that we have actually moved on. So let me say a few things about the capital expenditure. Of course, it's echo Nitya's thoughts in saying that, of course, all of us like to see increase in capital expenditure, and capital expenditure has been increased by more than 24% if you're comparing the budget estimates with the revised estimates. And I think that's a fair kind of comparison to make. Now, will this number hold itself? Will the government be able to spend this kind of an amount on make this kind of a capital expenditure, given the fact that it wants to keep the fiscal deficit, fixed at about 6% or thereabouts. Now, why I say this is that I did some back of the envelope calculations looking at of the expenditure numbers. Now, what I find is that the revenue expenditure has increased, or the proposal is to increase the revenue expenditure by just over 4%. So capital expenditure increases by 24%, the revenue expenditure increases by 4%. And this 4% number is actually a decline in real terms, because if you look at the current rate of inflation and the number that has been assumed by the government in providing us with the GDP estimates, which came on 31st of January, according to the government, the inflation is more than 8%, 8.5%, if I'm not mistaken. And if you look at the from the gross capital formation, if you look at the inflation they expect for capital goods, it's about 14%. Yeah. So if you put all these numbers into the bucket and then you try to understand where we are in terms of expenditure, I feel that given the low expenditure on allocations on revenue, and the anxiety to keep the fiscal deficit fixed at about 6% or thereabouts, there could be a shift of funds away from capital expenditure to revenue, because you can't actually postpone revenue expenditure. Most of that in terms of salaries and other things, so you can't really postpone that, and so that's an issue that is important. That whether this number of capital expenditure is going to sustain itself. And of course, the 24%, if you look at it in real terms, it comes down to about 10%, which is also not bad actually. Yeah, but this is the issue. Now, Nitya also mentioned that agriculture, and we are expecting the government to take some initiatives on agriculture. Given the fact that there's been I think at the end of the day, has been a sort of appreciation on the government's part that there are problems that the farmers are facing, and there are issues there. So if we recognize that the farmers are really facing problem, and many farmers are saying that agriculture is no longer a paying occupation, then both in terms of institutions and infrastructure, things have to be done. So, of course, on irrigation and all, again, Nitya mentioned there is additional spending that has been promised. But there are other, capital expenditure requirements of agriculture other than just irrigation, and where I felt that there should have been a greater degree of attention. Government is talking a lot about the farmer producer organizations and strengthening the farmer producer organizations, which is a good thing. Putting the farmer empowering the farmer through these organizations. But then you need to allocate resources to strengthen that these institutions. But you don't find adequate allocation being made. For instance, for agriculture, the allocation has been increased by about 5%. Again, in real terms, it's lesser than that. Health and health expenditure and education expenditure need to flag the very important issues that we face in this country. There's a huge deficit that we have in terms of learning, and now last 2 years things have become even worse. So there was a need to actually strengthen the school system and take it to the and slowly put it to the in a path of virtuous growth. But on education, there's no capital expenditure on creating new institutions. There's a little bit on higher education, but that also is not really meaningful. So the government is not thinking of brick and mortar in terms of education. I think everything is going to go online. Digitalization of education has been emphasized, but again, I need to mention quite clearly that digitalization has only increased inequity. So the inequity that he talked about has happened in general. Has actually got far bigger when it comes to providing education for people, and it has become extremely large thanks to this whole digitalization push. Health and family welfare expenditure has increased, even capital expenditure has increased, but the expenditure is mainly on creating more AIIMS, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and spreading this in other countries. What was really required was the primary health centers, and this is something that we have been saying from this platform year and year, repeatedly, that the infrastructure required by the common people, has to be strengthened. Because we don't go to the hospitals in the first instance. So when we fall ill, the first thing that we do is to go to a neighborhood doctor. Hospitals come later. So unless this gap is filled, there's a huge gap out there, and which needs to be addressed. On NREGA and PDS, there are other colleagues who will obviously sort of contribute, and they have already flagged this issue. And I'll only say a couple of things, and I'll stop on the receipt side of it. The total receipts are expected to increase by less than 10%, and the tax receipts will also increase by a similar or 9.6% compared to the revised estimates. Now, possibly there is an element of underestimation, because if we accept government's numbers on the buoyancy on the GST front, and the way she also announced it in the budget that at GST record levels. So possibly there.
सुनो my daughter सुन रहे हैं.
Yeah, but every year I am curious. I get curious when I look at one of the annexes of the receipts budget, which gives numbers on incentives. Now we call it incentives. Earlier we used to call it revenue foregone. And there's one table. The first table relates to the corporate sector, and it gives the numbers on the range of profits that the top corporate sector makes, and of course the revenue generation from those corporates. There are about 9 lakh companies which do e-filing, and this is reported in the budget in the annexure 7, and every year when I look at this number, I find that the companies who are reporting losses or the companies who are saying we do not have any profits, that number is consistently increasing. This year, that number is 54%. So 54% of the companies, and these are large companies, these are all doing e-filing, are declaring that they do not have earned any profits or they are running into losses. So obviously the question will come in all our minds that why is the government letting go all these companies? Obviously there is something. If they're consistently, and this number was 35% in 2005-06, today is 54%. So there is something that is seriously going wrong with our revenue generation drive. So I'll stop here. I think I've taken longer than I should have. I couldn't be responsible enough as the chair. But let me now invite Professor Atul Sharma, and we'll hear from Professor Sharma his views on the budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Vishwajit, and good morning to everybody, fellow panelists. Already a lot of grounds have been covered by both Professor Vishwajit and Nityananda. And I'll be limited to only two types of issues. One, the thrust of this budget, broad thrust of the budget. And second is that how the thrust or budget proposals address the issues at hand. I would confine myself only to these aspects. But before I begin, I wanted to share with you that I was always reminded when I was listening to the budget, I was remembering very repeatedly what that Vishwajit has referred to. Keynes' famous saying. Let me quote what he said. That in the long run, we are all dead. Economists set themselves too easy. If in tempestuous seasons, they can only tell that when the storm is long past, the ocean is flat, unquote. So this was a reminder because the thrust of the budget was on the long term. Actually, it's based on 4 pillars for the Amrut Kal of 25 years. It is interesting, in the bad old days of planning, when plan was made, there was a perspective plan. But perspective plan basically try to coordinate the thinking of the experts, policymakers, and other all to coordinate on the issues of goal, strategies, and policy options. But when the Amrut Kal for 25 years was talked about, I don't find there is any document backs it. Actually, this seems to be a practice when the government was saying that by 2025, Indian economy will achieve the growth of, will reach $5 trillion. But it is not documented, it is not based on any kind of thinking, organized or coordinated thinking. As Niti Aayog, I don't see any paper which backs the Amrut Kal and all the 4 pillars of the foundation. 4 pillars is investment, basically, infrastructure, and then inclusive development, and one more is the four I's basically, and infrastructure. These are the four pillars. These are four pillars of the new India. But actually, it looks to me there's a deficit. There will be a dichotomy between the new economy and the traditional, a tiny new economy and a large traditional economy, which will substitute perhaps Bharat and India. It will be something like a different meaning of Bharat and India. The new India and the traditional India. But having said that, I would like to compliment the finance minister on one account, maybe two. That is, for the last 2 years, she has presented the budget in a very transparent manner, avoiding any kind of creative accounting. For that, I think she deserves compliment. Second thing, I don't know whether it is a compliment or not, but she has attempted to contain the fiscal deficit. More importantly, revenue deficit. Prudent fiscal management requires to contain revenue management because revenue expenditure has a bad name. So it is a prudent fiscal management means you have to contain the revenue expenditure. So in that sense, I'm not so sure it is whether that's good or bad, but in that sense, revenue expenditure is really contained. It is attempted to brought down from 4.9% earlier, I think, to 3.8%. And fiscal deficit is also has increased a little, but not much, given all the problems. But then, for the fiscal deficit, 70% of them will be financed through market borrowing, basically treasury bills and government securities. This is like the idea is to induce government expenditure is intended to induce private expenditure. But in that process, what is likely to happen when the 70% will be based on market borrowing, it is likely to crowd out the private investment, private borrowing. There's a risk in that. Now I come to the growth recovery. Professor Biswajit and Professor Nityananda have already talked about it. I want to talk about a little detail. The one of the major issue at hand is to revive the economy. But revival means that we have to, we have to really grow faster. Professor Biswajit has talked about that even in 2019-20, the growth has come down to 3.7%. More importantly, when you go into details, that capital formation, fixed capital formation, gross fixed capital formation came down from 34.3% in 2011-12 to 28.9%. Investment came down from 39% to 32.2%. And gross saving, which came down from 35 to 30% in 2019-20. And household saving has come down from 23.6% to 17.2%. So this is this is because in one of the four drivers of the India economy: government consumption, export, investment, and private consumption. It is all well known that private consumption is the driver of the Indian economy. And when the private consumption is declined, the private consumption is declined from 60%, 60.5% in 2019-20 to 57.5%. So this problem is not just COVID, it is the before COVID. With the 2019 itself is 1920, there's a serious structural problem. So the revival of growth has to be addressed, keeping in view all these structural, all these problems. But thrust of the budget is on capital expenditure. I think capital expenditure, there is no quarrel about capital expenditure. It has gone up really substantially to 7 lakh crore from 66 lakh crore, which is a substantial jump. The two things we know, one thing we know that infrastructure, Indian producers find it difficult to compete globally. One of the constraints is infrastructure cost is high. The second is that the logistic cost is high. It is 13 to 14% in India, as against about 8 to 9% in most developed countries. It's a very high. That's why producers find it very difficult to compete globally. So this is understandable and this is desirable to focus on infrastructure, logistic expenditure. In that sense, the focus is very clear and good. But difficulty is that out of this 7 lakh crore, more than 3 lakh crore will be transferred to the states for creating assets. This is all good, but devil lies in implementation. Implementation it involves time, but it is a notoriously sluggish implementation. As a result, with this capital expenditure would be able to address the issues that are at hand. I will be addressing only 2-3 issues. And in the context, as you all know, that COVID-19 has impacted not only economy, but also society in a big way. And one aspect is already, it was mentioned, is the unemployment. The estimate is that about 2.3 million people, 2.3 crore people have become, 23 million people have been unemployed. It's a CMI figure. Has lost jobs during the COVID period. Actually, it began with the demonetization and it worsened the lockdown to contain COVID-19, worsened the situation. So this, where the budget, through the capital expenditure, where the budget projects is a 60 lakh crore, 60 crore. Yes, 60 lakh, yes, 60 lakh job creation, which means 12 lakh per annum, 60 lakh in 5 years. Against the requirement of against the 2.3 crore unemployment. In addition, there is an addition to the labor force every year to the tune of 11 million. 1.1. Unemployment is a very serious issue. But this is sort of private this expenditure, the capital expenditure will not be able to address the employment generation. It is there in the government of India budget also does not recognize that it will be able to address only, will be able to generate only 60 lakh jobs. So it falls terribly short of the requirement. And coming to on the top of this is the inflation, which was also mentioned earlier, that according to RBI figure, it is already 5.7%. And when we did study earlier that whenever inflation rises, it is the poor which is affected most. Already they have lost jobs, they have lost income. On the top of it, the price is going up. So that would really hurt people very much. But if on the other side is the food subsidy has been reduced. Food subsidy, which could probably give some kind of holiday, has been reduced from 2.9 lakh crore to 0.07 lakh crore. And similarly, NREGA allocation has been reduced by 20. NREGA gives the employment, it's a demand-driven program. Only the most needy people go for NREGA works. Now their allocation has been reduced by 25%. But however, the government has given, budget has provided 2.7, I think 2.7 lakh crore in terms of MSP. But what is lost sight of? 86% of the total holdings are marginal and small, which means 0 to less than 2 hectares of land. This 86%, 86.2% marginal and small and marginal farmers are not likely to have any surplus. And as a result, they will not benefit from this MSP, only MSP for provision. What is more, that even if suppose some have got surplus, if MSP benefit one can get only when there's a procurement agency. In large part of the country, there's no presence of the procurement agency. So this is just nominal. And then farmers will not have the access. Even large farmers in some of the places will not get any benefit from the MSP, where there is no presence of procurement agency. So this is about job loss. But job loss, as a result of job loss, there is also income loss. On the study of one study by the Azim Premji, State of Working in India report 2021, estimated that COVID-19 pushed 230 million people, 230 million people into poverty. As I said earlier, that all those NREGA, food subsidy, they give some support structure, but that all have been cut down. Now coming to the health and health, there's just a few months before the COVID-19, there was a your declaration, I'll quote it because that is important. Apart from inadequacy in health services, which has been exposed nakedly during the COVID-19, there's a kind of endorsement of at the United Nations General Assembly in September 2019, just a few months prior to the pandemic. All countries endorsed a political declaration on universal health coverage, affirming that, quote, health is a precondition for an outcome, an indicator of the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, unquote. It is now noteworthy that universal health care does not mean just health care provided by health workers in the health facilities. It also includes all those services that promote health and prevent disease at the population level. Outbreak surveillance, safe water, sanitation, etc., just to give a few examples. Thus, universal health care has many benefits beyond treating diseases and include improved health security and better protection against the ravages of future pandemics and epidemics. As the IMF in one of its papers has noted, that no country has made significant progress toward universal health care without relying on public monies as its main funding source. The budget has not significantly augmented, or rather remained stagnant at budget 2021-22. So when the requirement is so large that it's, of course, the health is a state subject, and the state will have to allocate. But even so, health aid at the best of time does not account for. It accounts for barely 1% of GDP, in spite of all this. I'd like to say a few remarks. One observation about resource mobilization. From one perspective, budget is very good that it has been able to maintain the stability in the tax system. But tax GDP share in India's tax GDP share is one of the smallest among the comparable countries, lowest among the comparable countries. It is 18% as compared to 20 to 28% with some of the emerging countries like Brazil, China, and South Africa. But then there's no attempt to say government budget or attempt. Actually, government in last few years have been focusing more on dismantling the public assets created, privatization of public enterprises, or asset demonetization. That is the way of mobilizing resources. But no attempt has been made to increase tax GDP ratio. There's scope for it. I'll give you a couple of things. And this is important because in a country like ours, the income distribution, which was mentioned by Professor Biswajit, has worsened. And it has also so much that profit share has gone up while wealth share has declined. The quarterly net profit of the BSE 200 companies recorded a high of 1.67 trillion rupees in the third quarter of financial year 2020-21, up by 57% over the year on year. Lucas Chancel, another estimate in World Inequality Index. This report is coordinated by Thomas Piketty. They observed the top 1% of India's population earned 20.7% of the national income in 2020-21, while the bottom 50% just 13.1%. Another figure is that when they talk about the wealth, top 1% of India own 33% of wealth, while the bottom 50% only 5.9%. It's the kind of wealth income and wealth accumulation. And in fact, 140 persons in India owns 53 lakh crore of worth of wealth, which is much larger than the state domestic product of several states of the country. So given such accumulation of wealth or concentration of wealth and income, it is important to consider to levy tax on the ultra-rich classes. That's one area. A second thing, which was second is the area accumulation. Year after year, the tax areas have been rising, growing, and a large part is under, some part is under litigation. This, this is very, I think this is a very important gesture which the initiative to which the budget has taken. They're trying to simplify the provisions so that the litigation comes down. So it's a very positive initiative. So these are the points. So what I would like to conclude, I don't want to take much time, any more time. The total resource mobilization, there are many areas. One other area is the GST. GST is a great tax. It is a game-changing tax reform, but it is very poorly designed. And poorly designed as a result of which we have not been able to realize the potential of GST. Therefore, it was expected that the budget would propose some expert committee or persuade the GST Council to appoint a technical committee to design for their recommend on the design of the GST. GST itself, 13th Finance Commission made a very elaborate exercise to estimate the potential of GST. And in fact, it has got huge growth potential. It's huge export.
यहाँ से लोग देख रहे हैं आपको इसमें और देव का फोन आया था कि साहब सोए हुए हैं हमको जाके देखेंगे लोग देख रहे हैं इस स्क्रीन में तो खराब इंप्रेशन होता है उठ जाइए पार्टिसिपेट करने में कोई फायदा नहीं.
So let me conclude by saying that I think there are some of the initiatives which are extremely important, and the corporate's trust on capital expenditure is most welcome. But what is more important, equally important, is to address the imminent issues and the structural problems. But we don't see much attempt to really to address this imminent problem. that like unemployment, job loss, poverty redressal, income loss. These are not. We don't find any possibility that a budget will contribute much to redress these kind of issues which the economy has really faced. Thank you very much. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you for your wonderful insights and on a large number of issues. Maybe if you have time, then we can sort of discuss it later. Let me now invite Professor Ashwini Mahajan. Nitya had already introduced him. He's a co-convener of Swadeshi Jagran Manch and is a professor in PGDAB College. So, Ashwini ji, you have the floor now.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Vishwajit Dhar ji, respected Muchkund Dubey ji, Vishwajit Dhar ji, Nityanand ji, Professor Atul Sharma ji, and all brothers and sisters present here in this webinar. In fact, I always look forward to understand the budget from different perspectives. Especially, I always wait for the CSD to organize the program for budget discussions. This year, we are missing Professor Haq, especially for his insights into the agriculture aspect of the budget. My take on the budget, always I try to analyze and look at the budget from the perspective of Swadeshi. So I was very happy when I looked into the budget speech and found that no mention of FDI has been made. Mostly in the years of post liberalization, post new economic policy, every budget we used to find with a lot of praise and expectations about FDI and all sorts of measures which could be adopted to attract FDI. And we have seen in the yesteryears what has happened. And since the days of 1991, we find we find always the word protection was always avoided, and it was considered to be a very bad word. I'm happy since 2018, since the February 2018, the word protection has been used, and it was said in so many words by the finance minister that we are raising tariffs to protect the domestic industry. So, this has continued since 2018, and in this year as well, we find a lot of talk about the protection and the raising of tariffs and so on. So I always try to see what this budget can do, moving both away from the legacy of Nehru as well as the legacy of the Dr. Manmohan Singh and the legacy of WTO influenced economic policies or World Bank influenced economic policies. So my friends will appreciate here that since the days of Nehru, the lot of public expenditure on capital, lot of capital expenditure used to be made those days to build more and more of public sector undertakings. But I'm not trying to, give any judgment on that, whether that was a good or a bad policy. But that definitely was, was crowding out the private investment, because when you have more and more of public sector undertakings producing different types of goods and services, obviously private investment in those sectors will get hampered, and that was basically a policy of the making public expenditure and crowding out of the private investment. But this time, when the finance minister was making the budget speech, she said very clearly that we are raising this capital expenditure by 35% as compared to the budget estimates, and as respected, since there has been an increase in the capital expenditure during the current year, so the increase is approximately 24 to 25% of the revised estimates. But still this is a big increase, and almost everybody amongst us, we have been appreciative of this increase in public expenditure, public capital expenditure. So the very point which I'm trying to make here is that if you increase public capital expenditure, and if that leads to an increase in the overall capital formation in the country, and most of the speakers here, we have been very wary of declining gross capital formation in the country, fixed capital formation in the country, and as the numbers are also suggesting, we have come down from nearly 39% to hardly 27-28% of the, or approximately 30% if we take the overall gross capital formation. So this was a big decline, and everybody was worried about it. And if this capital expenditure by the government can crowd in the private investment, so we should be able to fill that gap which has occurred, and which is impacting our overall growth, as well as the state of public services, and state of overall infrastructure in the country. And in fact, there has been a big reform. In fact, in the past, the reforms were, from me, reforms were not very welcome, because those reforms used to be in attracting more and more of FDI, or reducing the tariffs to attract more and more of imports. So that never used to be very welcome, especially from the point of view of Swadeshi Jagrat Manch. But this time we find that reform which has occurred, and in fact which has found place in terms of the expenditure part, is the Gati Shakti. And in fact, this whole Gati Shakti project needs to be understood, and this can really help us in reducing our logistic costs, and our country, if we are failing in raising exports, is basically because of the high logistic costs as well. So this Gati Shakti project, which the finance minister has mentioned again and again in the budget, needs to be understood. And if the money does not go into one or the other kind of infrastructure projects, and rather than that, if the Gati Shakti project can be taken up in an integrated manner, the rail, road, air, digitalization, and everything, getting integrated to reduce the logistic costs. So that can really be very helpful in reducing the logistic cost and thereby the competitiveness of Indian exports and also the domestic production vis-a-vis imported goods. So that point I wanted to make, that this goes well with our objective of increasing the growth, because if the capital formation, the desired capital formation is not taking place both by the private sector as well as by the public sector, then the high rate of growth which we expect, we are always worried, like, the growth has come down to 4%, 5%. So high rate of growth is possible if and only if we make a lot of capital formation, and that without the government support and government share in the capital formation, this was not very likely. And this is a welcome step in the government budget, especially in terms of the crowding in of the private investment. Because I hope private investment will come in different sectors, including the physical infrastructure like railroad and others, and also the digital infrastructure, and about the infrastructure for the potable water and also the housing. So a lot of private investment is expected. So the time will tell how much we are able to do that or achieve that. This is one part of the story. When I look at from the point of view of the Swadeshi, the second point I find the welcome thing in the budget is that we are trying to be more and more protective for the domestic industry. Apart from the protection, we are also trying to encourage through production linked incentive schemes. More than 2 lakh crores were already announced for the next in the overall 3-4 years. And then the last, because the concerns have been raised by my earlier speakers, that the overall supply is getting hampered, also because of the shortage of semiconductors. So the shortages have been, flagged by the earlier speakers, but I would like to say that mostly that was due to the maybe automobile sector or other sectors. It was because of the shortage of semiconductors, for which we never thought of producing in our country. So about $10 billion of support by the government for semiconductors, and also I used to always tell the concerned ministers that this is no good giving push to the solar energy without there being any solar equipment manufacturing capacity in the country. So that has also been, got the ear, and I find 19,500 crores being offered for or allocated for the solar equipment product manufacturing in the country. But while we are really talking about growth and and raising our capital formation, both the public as well as private, we know in the past the private sector has been sitting on huge amount of surplus funds, but they were not ready to invest. And during COVID time, again, the top corporates have their profits have been increasing, and many new billionaires are also taking birth in the country. Number of billionaires is increasing, and but no investment taking place as the numbers show. So if this budget can help raising that capital formation, that will be good. But what I find the downside of the budget is that we are not giving enough attention to the creation of more employment opportunities. I'm not talking of jobs, more employment opportunities, because unless or until the jobs are employment opportunities are not created, the problem of inequalities will continue to be there. And unemployment is the major cause of poverty. So unemployment, poverty, inequalities, they are all interrelated, and job creation, the employment creation is the only solution. But over the years, we have been giving much emphasis on growth and more on the corporate sector, more on the FDI, more on the MNCs. So obviously the jobs were not getting created. But and this budget also does talk about growth, does talk about capital formation, but again, the job creation, the employment creation did not find the mention in the budget as such. Somebody said that employment का ई भी इसमें बजट में दिखाई नहीं दिया कहीं पर बोलते हुए. So what we suggested even before the budget, that we can give encouragement to the employment creation by giving sort of subsidies to the small scale and also even the large scale industry, where they employ more people, they can be given subsidy. Similarly, if we encourage more and more of small scale MSME sector, especially the micro and small sector, the job creation will automatically take place. Apart from that, since the days of Nehru, we have forgotten about entrepreneurship in the country, and hardly any efforts from the government on entrepreneurship development is taking place. So what we feel, and we have even started a campaign for entrepreneurship development. So what we had been suggesting the government is that, we can start entrepreneurship development centers at the district level, so that the boost for new enterprise startups is one thing, and that the government might be doing on its own, but entrepreneurship development centers and creation of job opportunities, creation of employment opportunities in the rural areas, especially the support to the allied activities to agriculture, support for the food processing, support for the mushroom farming, dairy, and so many. So luckily, our dairy sector is quite protected and is developing well. But just in by encouraging dairy in one or two states, we could become the world leader and topmost producer of dairy products or milk in the world. So easily we can be world leader in almost every agricultural produce. The post being given to the uh, mm, organic and zero budget natural farming will lead to a reduction in the cost for farmers, and also may reduce the content of chemicals in our food plate. Uh, uh, and this is also an encouraging thing that the government is now trying to push the uh, oilseed sector. So that can improve our self-reliance in the agricultural produce, especially in the because we have surplus of food grains. That surplus really benefited us, no doubt about it, in while we were distributing ration to the poor people during the COVID. But so much of surplus of food grains can be avoided by encouraging more of oil seeds. But what I feel is that agriculture, we need to give more support to the for the constitutions of the FPOs. We need to reduce the number of the limit which is very high for the farmers. So we can reduce the number to 50 farmers, so that more and more, because gathering 300 farmers to form a FPO and a support from the government for the formation of FPOs can also be a welcome step. But this budget has failed to provide that. So I personally, I'm not in favor of, the doles from the government for in any form. But till the time our people are poor, they are not, and because of the policies of the previous governments or this government, if the people are remaining poor, they need to be provided with food, they need to be provided with cash, they need to be provided with the Manrega type policies, jobs. But we need to bring those policies which can empower people to have a meaningful employment, which can help raise their incomes so that they can meet their basic requirements. Till the time, we need all such types of supports. But personally, in a way, I feel, because government fails to provide for those kinds of policies which can empower people to earn enough. So that is coming in way of the real welfare of the people. So, so in the times to come, the government, if the government provides more and more of support for self-employment, more and more support for entrepreneurship, more and more support for creating more jobs, then only we can say that this is a real welfare state. So welfare state doesn't mean, to my understanding, and from the point of view of the organization which I belong to, welfare state doesn't mean that the government provides the support or doles for meeting your two ends. The government support should be to provide you with an ecosystem, provide you with the support which can help you earn more and more so that you can meet the two ends. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwini ji. And I think your last last point you made was particularly important, because I think eventually the government will have to make people stand up on their own 2 feet, and this is extremely important, and that's why we've been also emphasizing that in agriculture, these kinds of subsidies is should be considered as temporary. Eventually, the farmer should be able to earn the right price or get the right price for their produce, and rely less on the government handouts. And that kind of environment has to be created through investment in agriculture, the appropriate investment in agriculture. Thank you very much for your views. Let me now invite Professor KB Saxena. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Vishwajit. My remit is the marginalized sections. I was specifically only asked to deal with it, so therefore I'll disappoint Nityananda if I don't cover agriculture. Before I come to marginalized sections proper, I'll make 3 or 4 general remarks. One of them is that in the budget speech of the Prime Minister, the only reference to the marginalized groups is about the tax relief scheme for the disabled, where some policy changes have been made. And the indirect references is with regard to new generation Anganwadi centers, for which there is no allocation, and e-Vidya channels for dealing with the digital divide. So this shows, lack of sensitivity about marginalized groups which constitute largest section of the people. And the budget speech and the whole financial policy architecture does not deal with the core concerns of the marginalized groups and the constraints they suffer from. Second point I will make is that marginalized groups in which are included women, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, children, religious minorities, and disabled persons, they have faced disproportionate and differential impact in several domains, not merely with regard to the pandemic as a result of the pandemic, but also with regard to the earlier policy shocks like demonetization and ill-prepared GST and all that. So, and these domains are poverty, employment, food security, health and nutrition, and the risk of violence and indebtedness. But there is therefore there is a acute need for giving welfare support for their dignified survival. Unfortunately, the cash transfer which was provided in the first year of the pandemic was discontinued later. This cash transfer was in regard to Jan Dhan accounts, and the free food under the Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana, which was provided till last year, has been discontinued. And as regards Manrega, already the speakers have pointed out that the budget allocation have been reduced, which will further restrict, the possibility of giving them employment. So therefore, we find that the sections of the society which are the first sufferers have been really totally become invisible in the policy domain. The third point I would point out that, as Mr. Ashwini Mahajan has also pointed out, the unemployment is the key. And unemployment is the only route through which, provision of employment is the only route through which, both inequality can be reduced and, and also, some kind of welfare support can also come. But unfortunately, the only strategy of the government, as I understand, is public investment in public infrastructure and credit support, for self-employment. But public infrastructure, big ticket infrastructure does not really create employment. As Nitya also pointed out, is highly capital intensive. And the only infrastructure which does provide the direct employment to the kind of people which consist of marginalized groups is a Manrega type of infrastructure. But because the Manrega allocation have been reduced, so that possibility is also dim. Of course, Gramin Sadak Yojana, where allocations have been increased, is a welcome point. This will certainly help to a limited extent. But as regards credit support, now one should realize that everybody cannot become an entrepreneur overnight. People who have been used to do wage labor cannot become entrepreneurs. So therefore, credit support is not a win-all situation, where you can extend credit and they will raise self-employment. Then credit-based employments have also several problems: technology problem, productivity problems, and also marketing support. But even with regard to credit support, we find that the two sources through which credit used to come is Mudra Yojana and also Startup India. In both these programs, the allocations have been reduced. The third route through which credit support was provided was emergency credit scheme for MSMEs. Now, as far as MSMEs are concerned, there are very few enterprises which are owned by scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and women. And secondly, because of the impact of demonetization, GST, and also pandemic, many of the MSEs are closed. What they need is direct cash support rather than credit. So therefore, that possibility of providing employment is also nil. Now, fourth point I will make is that these groups are concentrated in the informal sector, and many of them are migrant labor. Their plight was very glaringly visible during post-lockdown. They lack access to social security nets. They need government-funded pension and other social protection schemes. But unfortunately, the only government-funded security scheme is the NSAP, National Social Assistance Program, which is hugely underfunded. Of course, there has been a measly 5% increase in this budget, but already there is so much of unmet need, and because also this scheme, the unit cost of support is so low. It has not been revised in the 1990s, and every year, there is a clamor, for increasing the social safety net by increasing the amount of pension as well as the coverage. But this has not come to this. Is very disappointing. Now, as far as marginalized groups are concerned, the first thing to be noted is that the resource flow from the government comes in two modes. One mode is the resources allocated to the ministry, which deal with the schemes directly related to the concerned group. Second mode is, and which is far more important than the ministry mode, is various other departments which deal with programs which have relevance for this section. And so therefore, all these sections have some kind of a sub-plan approach, where earmarked funds, come from those departments to these sections. But we find that with regard to the sub-plan arrangements, the whole idea has been completely defeated. In the sub-plan arrangements, the concerned ministries are only treating it as a reporting mechanism, without ensuring that the amount that they have earmarked for this section are really spent specifically on them on need-based schemes. This does not happen. They merely assume that because they have allocated certain percentage of funds, to these groups, the benefits automatically follow. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen unless these departments formulate schemes, need-based schemes for them, and unless they ensure that physical achievement of this scheme reaches the concerned section, this will not happen. But unfortunately, these supply arrangements in respect of all these sections suffer from lack of coordination, lack of monitoring, lack of coordination, and lack of linkage of physical achievement with the resource flow. The second point I will make about these groups is that many of the earlier schemes which were launched for women and children have been, particularly for women and children, have been rationalized by merging them into a single scheme. And we find that the merged scheme allocation is lower than the individual allocations of the earlier scheme. So in totality, what happens is that in the process of rationalization, these sections are getting lower resource allocation from the budget than they used to get. The third point that I would make is that the resource allocation to the ministries in respect of these sections show either a stagnant allocation or a very highly negligible increase, like 3%, 4%, 6%. This kind of small increase hardly makes any sense because schemes cannot be strengthened. Schemes, expansion of coverage cannot take place, and therefore, they remain, neglected. And we find that even with this increase, there is a decline in the percentage of allocation coming from the union budget to them. So altogether, the marginalization of these groups, gets embedded in the whole financial policy architecture. Now, so what is important is that these groups are voiceless, have no clout in policy making. They really need effective interlocutors to see that, that these other competing demands do not crowd them out, of consideration. Now, coming to specific marginalized groups like gender, despite the fact that there is a provision of gender responsive budgeting mechanism to see that women get, their share, but unfortunately, this mechanism has failed to address women's core issues like employment, social protection, and risk of violence. Now, gender-sensitive mechanism has two parts, 10A and 10B. Part 10A part deals with schemes which directly benefit women, and 10B deals with the scheme where a resource flow comes from other ministries, and there is an indirect benefit going to them. It doesn't linkage. It's not specifically targeted. One is specifically targeted, and other is not specifically targeted. So we find that there are a larger number of departments are making contribution in schemes which are not specifically targeted. So therefore, efforts should be made to see that when other departments are allocating resources for gender-sensitive budget, they must target these groups so that the benefits to them can be ensured. Now, gender-sensitive mechanism has continued to adopt the binary approach towards gender. They have ignored the fact that transgender has been recognized as a separate gender category, but their binary category of male and female does not take that into account. So therefore, the schemes relating to transgender, particularly there are two schemes relating to transgender. We do not find their mention in the gender-sensitive mechanism. Then the major problem of women, as of course other marginalized groups, is that particularly for women, is labor force participation, which was one of the lowest in the world, 18.6%. It has increased to 22.8% recently, but this increase is in the non-paid sector, that is the family labor. So it doesn't really improve, their participation. Now, with regard to labor force participation, the schemes which are required are, public employment, particularly NREGA. We already have pointed out the NREGA allocation has been reduced, and particularly NREGA allocation has not merely been reduced, but it is found that there is a huge gap, between the person demanding employment and the person who have received employment. Ministry's reporting mechanism points out that this percentage is 11%, but non-official reports are far higher. So therefore, when already with 93,000 crore allocation of last year, you find that there is a 11% gap in the provision of employment as against demand. You can imagine that when the allocations are reduced, there would be a further decrease in employment. And we find that even with the increased allocation, the average days of employment that is provided under NREGA is 51 or 52%. So therefore, even 100 days guarantee is not met. Now, this will get further reduced when the allocations are reduced. And we also find that even with 93,000 crore allocation last year, there are liabilities already of that year which have to be met from there. So altogether, the chances of providing more public sector employment in NREGA are weak. As regards self-employment, I have already pointed out that even the credit support which was provided by Mudra Yojana and Startup Yojana has also reduced, and emergency credit scheme does not really help them because very few MSMEs are owned by them. The third point, I will point out that all these sections belong to the informal sector, and this informal sector, the plight of which was glaringly reflected during the lockdown, is that they lack social security. Now, social security, it was expected that the budget will at least deal with this aspect, but unfortunately, as I pointed out, the National Social Assistance Program has ignored it. There is a measly increase of 5%. Maternity benefit scheme also, although National Food Security Act provides, that the women with is eligibility of women with two live births, but this eligibility was reduced by the government to only one eligible birth. So therefore, even the legal entitlement under the National Food Security Act has also not been met. Now, women's health issues are also a major concern, and this is reflected in the during the pandemic. Even in the vaccine coverage, only as against 100 vaccinations for the male, in case of women, only 62%. So there also, there is a kind of gap in coverage needs to be met. Besides lower vaccine coverage, there is an increase in anemia, which has been brought out by National Family Planning Survey, Family Service Survey. Now, and thirdly, there is a huge mental health problems relating to depression, violence, and stress. Now, there is a scheme in the budget, budget speech of the finance minister relating to national telemedicine program. Although the scheme does not have any allocation, but the more important point is that telemedicine, will not help them. They need, in-person consultation, they need social support, they need community support, particularly in relation to mental health. So we really need trained mental health workers. We need really trained, we need really specific mental health clinics. And we particularly really need that in the primary health centers, there should be a specialist on mental health. Only then, women will be able to access. Telemedicine is not the answer. Now, the last point about the women is that the violence against them and the crime against them have increased, enormously increased. But unfortunately, the schemes for protection and safety are underfunded. Several schemes under the generic category of Sambal and Samarthya, they have faced a significant reduction in the resource allocation. The Nirbhaya Fund was created specifically for dealing with violence against women. This fund, this allocation remains underutilized. So altogether, in case of women, there are problems relating to low resource allocation. There are problems relating to lack of enforcement of law. There are problems relating to employment and all that. Then about the children. The children's vulnerability has tremendously increased, particularly as a result of the pandemic. And we find that the gains earlier made with regard to enrollment, with regard to food security, with regard to health and nutrition, they have been reversed. But unfortunately, the priority to children is lacking in the budget. And though the total outlay for children has increased by 8%, but as a share of the union budget, there is a decline. There is also a decline in the budget of Women and Child Development Ministry. The only area where the budget provision for children has been increased is with regard to post-matric scholarship under the Social Justice Ministry. Secondly, there is a new scheme announced by the Finance Minister relating to early childhood development scheme, under which 2 lakh new generation Anganwadi centers would be created. This is a parcel of implementation of the new education policy. But unfortunately, there is no outlay for the scheme mentioned in the program. Perhaps they will try to formulate the scheme first and then make allocation of resources. But we have found that in the past, schemes are announced, but the follow-up action does not take place, and the next year and the year after they are completely forgotten. So I hope this will not happen with regard to this early childhood development scheme. Then with regard to child health and nutrition, again under the midday meal scheme called PM Poshan, there's an 11% reduction. Now, as it is during the pandemic, there was complete disruption of this scheme because the schools were closed. And now that schools are slowly getting up, it was required that at least the existing allocation should be maintained, but this has not happened. So this will affect the nutrition of children. Then with regard to child and education receive the maximum portion of the resources under the children's budget. Now, as a result of closure of the schools and the resultant digital divide, the Finance Minister has announced e-Vidya channel, 200 e-Vidya channel to deal with this divide. But e-Vidya television channel, there is no specific financial allocation for this scheme. Apparently, this scheme would be implemented by NCERT, But NCERT has such a low budget of 10 crore. How would it, if we provide resource allocation for e-Vidya channels, one does not know. But what is important is that the digital divide that has been created, and because of the devastating impact it has had on the learning of children, what we need is more more in-person attention of teachers, and specific design of the programs which can fill this gap. E-Vidya channels can continue, can be created, but in-person, offline arrangements, are far more important. This post-matric scholarship scheme is the one area where substantial allocation have been provided. But this is because this is a demand-driven program, and it was completely choked of funds as a result of it during the past 2-3 years. The whole program was disrupted, and it has had a very, very adverse effect on those students who are pursuing their education. Many of them had to leave, drop out, and is joined as physical labor. So fortunately, this time a substantial allocation has been made, and because states, many of the states were filling the gap by providing from their own resources in the hope of claiming it from the center. So there were huge areas to be provided to the state, to compensate them. So I hope, that some part of compensation to the states, for having provided them a scholarship would be done. But even now, this allocation is inadequate, is still very inadequate. But I hope that, increased budget provision will continue to be made in the coming years so that at least the demand-driven nature of this program is met. Now, child protection is the most important. I forget to mention that while the post-matric scholarship increase in allocation is welcome, but pre-matric scholarship scheme budget provision has been reduced. We find that over the years, pre-matric scholarship scheme has been very neglected in implementation as well as in resource allocation. One does not know what are the bottlenecks, but pre-matric scholarship is an important point, particularly for weaker sections and poverty-ridden sections, because it will provide some little aid, to children and to the parents, to pursue their education. Now, child protection is one area where huge attention is required. Over the years, the children's budget allocation for children were largely consumed by education and secondly by health, and child protection was relatively ignored. Fortunately, this time there has been 44.72% increase in allocation under the mission Vatsalya. But guidelines under the scheme have not been drawn even after a year. So this is called marginalization. That even where you have increased allocation under a scheme, but if the scheme itself is rotting, and guidelines have not been drawn, and the scheme has not even been started. So therefore, increased allocation would be of no avail unless expeditious action is taken to enforce the scheme. Now, second point is that child protection as a result of the violence inflicted on children is the only strategy is institutional care, where children victimized by violence can be taken care of. But there is now a feeling that we should move away from institutionalized care to non-institutionalized care. By non-institutionalized care, we mean that instead of putting them in government-run or NGO-run institutions, we should give them, for adoption, so that they can get family environment and personal support. But for non-institutional care, to be provided, there is an agency called CARA under Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. But the resource allocation for this particular institution has also been reduced. So therefore, non-institutional care would be a non-starter. Now, most important the most important point is that the specific schemes dealing with violence of children, like child labor rescue program, like cybercrime, which has increased by 260%, allocation has been reduced by 76%. Child labor rescue program allocation has been reduced by 75%, and budget for Central Social Board, which provides assistance to NGOs to deal with children's problems, their budget has also been reduced. So therefore, you find that the overall vulnerability of children and the kind of priority attention that we require, is not recognized, let alone addressed. Coming to the scheduled caste, as I pointed out, that after the distinction between plan and non-plan has been abolished, and planning commission has been abolished, we find that the whole sub-plan strategy, which was built up during the UPA days, has been completely subverted. Now, because the sub-plan strategy was based on percentage allocation of resources from development schemes for SCs and STs in proportion to their population. Now what has happened is that the tribal sub-plan and scheduled caste sub-plan have been renamed as Development Action Plan for SCs and Development Action Plan for STs. Now, instead of resources coming from all development schemes, to this development action plan, the new provision is that only resources from centrally sponsored schemes and central sector schemes would flow to the development action plan. So therefore, in the new framework, the total resource allocation would go towards the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe would get reduced. Many of the development schemes which are not part of the centrally sponsored scheme or central sector scheme, would not be able to, would not be mandated to provide the requisite resource allocation for the tribal sub-plan and scheduled caste sub-plan. Besides, there are most important things that the total resource allocation which has come to development action plan for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. In case of scheduled caste, it is only 8.8% as against, their population of around 16%. In respect of tribal sub-plan, their percentage share is 5.5% as against, their population of 8%, which means that that even then in the new arrangement, the total resources that they are getting from development fund is far lower than the proportion of their population. This is about the resource flow. But more important than the resource, the quantum of resources is the neglect in terms of ensuring that benefits of these resources reach these groups. This sub-plan arrangements have virtually become a reporting mechanism, and there is a notional reporting about their benefits reaching. There is no physical linkage of benefits accruing to the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes from the resource allocation. This will only happen when the schemes, specific need-based schemes, are specifically designed for them, and there is a monitoring mechanism to ensure that the benefits reach them. This has not happened. So therefore, sub-plan arrangements have been subverted, both with regard to the quantum of resources allocated, and secondly, with regard to the absence of need-based schemes, and thirdly, with regard to monitoring to ensure that the benefits reach them. The post-matric scholarship, as I pointed out, is a welcome step, but still, even now, with substantial resource enhancement, the entire gap is not met, and therefore, being a demand-driven program and one of the oldest schemes, the scheme has been started in 1944. So therefore, this is a committed liability, and it should be ensured that adequate resource allocation should be made. And this has also been recommended by the Parliamentary Standing Committee. And pre-matric scholarship budget provision has been reduced by 1/3. It is important that the bottlenecks in respect of pre-matric scholarship should sorted out, and adequate enforcement should take place. The second most important scheme for scheduled caste is with regard to rehabilitation of manual scavengers. This is one of the oldest program, and so many times we have announced that by a certain year all the manual scavengers would be rehabilitated, but this has not happened. The most important bottleneck now is that lack of complete and credible identification. Now, how many manual scavengers are there to be rehabilitated? On this point, there is such a wide gap between the official sources, non-official sources, and within the official sources. For example, 2 surveys up to November 21 mentioned 58,000 manual scavengers. Census data to 2011 mentioned 26 lakh latrines, dry latrines, which means they are being serviced, by manual scavenger. So therefore, their number would be far larger. Then social and economic caste census identified 1.68 lakh manual scavengers in rural areas. They have no data about the urban areas. Then 2018 survey recently carried out pointed out that there are only 42,303 manual scavengers. So you find that there is such a large gap, such a large difference in the identification within the official count. And if you deal with non-official surveys, then the gap is huge. So one does not understand what is standing in the way of reconciling these figures in order to see that the manual, that the scheme is implemented. The second point is that under the Swachh Bharat program sanitation, large number of rural latrines have been created, and now urban latrines have also been created, which is very welcome. One would have hoped that manual scavenging, would be abolished, but unfortunately, because of the fact that and where dry latrines have been created, where under Swachh Bharat sanitary latrines have been created, there is a reluctance on the part of the householders, to clean these latrines. So therefore, they again depend upon manual scavengers, to do that. So therefore, even a sanitation program supposedly meant, to abolish manual scavenging is getting instrumental in extending, manual scavenging. This is very important. Unless the householders learn and agree and are willing and are mandated, to clean their own latrines, they will continue to oppress the scheduled caste, to clean their latrines, and the problem will never end. So this aspect, that is improvement of the condition of manual scavengers, abolition of the condition of manual scavengers must become an integral scheme. It must ensure that householders must clean their own latrines for this purpose. Second point is that it has been pointed out by the ministry that the manual scavengers which were identified have all been rehabilitated, which have been identified have all been rehabilitated with cash assistance of 40,000 rupees and a skill development program. But the non-official claim is that only 2.7% or 3% have received this assistance. So even with regard to the assistance provided by the ministry under the scheme, there is such a huge gap. So, but really does not understand why a simple scheme like this is creating such a problem of lack of coordination and lack of reconciliation. So this needs enforcement. As regards scheduled tribes, as I pointed out, their share of allocation under the CSSSS is only 5.5%. But the more important point that scheduled tribes is the most neglected category of all groups. And this is because, their problems are not merely resource flow, their problems are relating to the enforcement of their rights, Forest Rights Act, Land Rights Act, rehabilitation of displaced persons. Now, unless these rights are implemented, mere resource-based schemes will not be able to improve their condition, because development programs in other sectors are making adverse effects on them. There is no filtering mechanism to see that the adverse effects of other development programs, are adequately addressed. There is no mechanism. So therefore, what we require is that not merely enhanced resource flow for the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe as well as other weaker sections. What we require is a filtering mechanism whereby the adverse effects of other development programs particularly on the scheduled tribes are adequately addressed. And thirdly is that the specific rights of the scheduled tribes with regard to forest and land must be enforced, because studies have pointed out that the condition of tribals under the Northeast is far better than the condition of tribals in other fifth scheduled states. This is because the land rights and forest rights of the tribals in Northeast are far better protected than they are protected in the fifth scheduled area. So therefore, protection is an important part of their development. Protection and development cannot be separated, particularly in relation to scheduled tribe. And it's also in relation to scheduled caste, because both of them suffer, atrocities, and the incidence of atrocities is increasing. And because the implementation of Atrocities Act is highly constrained by lack of resources, we need more special courts, we need more and public prosecutors, we need strengthened machinery and all that. Now, with regard to religious minorities,
Biswajit, yes, sir. Excuse me, sir. Actually, we have gone well over time. Can you, because there is another speaker left.
No, I'll just take only 3-4 minutes. I'll finish.
Okay, sir.
I'll finish.
Thank you, sir.
That's 3 or 4 minutes. That with regard to religious minorities, there is a decline in outlay as a percentage of union budget from 0.14% to 0.12%, despite a very negligible increase of 4% in the budget of the ministry. Now, there are two strategies for religious minorities for their development. One is a 15-point program of the Prime Minister, which deals with education, employment, and improvement in living standards. And second is the multi-sectoral development program. Both programs suffer from huge problems with regard to 15-point program. The requirement is that 15% of funds should flow from other development ministries to the minorities. Although the strength of the minority is 21%, but only 15% funds are to be flown from them. But this is happening only with regard to 3 or 4 departments. So there is a lack of effort, to see that more and more departments should allocate resources for minorities under the 15-point program. But the more important part is that there is a lack of specific earmarking under the central sector schemes and centrally sponsored schemes for minorities. And really is that earlier ministries used to report about the share of minorities in employment budgetary allocation. This has been discontinued. But the most important program of the ministry was scholarship. But scholarship programs suffer from very poor coverage and low unit cost. This has not been devised. The worst part is that the unit cost and coverage with regard to scheduled caste, scheduled tribes and minorities are so different. This is absolutely unacceptable. Thirdly is that Prime Minister had announced 2 years back that there will be 1 crore scholarship, under the for minority. But as against them, even after 2 years, there is only 52% persons under the post-matric scholarship and 36.7% under the pre-matric scholarship have received this scholarship. This gap remains, which shows the lack of adequate resource allocation. Lastly, is that persons with disabilities, the most neglected section. There is only one reference to the insurance scheme for tax relief that has pointed out. There are only under this scheme also it is required that resource should flow from the other department, but other departments are not. Only 4 departments have disaggregated data for the disabled person, but all of them show decline in their budget provision. There is a marginal increase of 3% allocation for the department. But the last point that I make is that there are only 2 important schemes of the department. One is the distribution of assistive devices. National Sample Survey has pointed out that of all the persons who have received assistive devices, only 5.9% have received it from the government program. The remaining persons have received it from the private channel, which is a pity. It's the oldest scheme. I really don't understand what stands in the way of a government scheme reaching the people. That is one point. Secondly, the second important scheme is the cash compensation for pension as a pension scheme for social protection. This is also a very low coverage of 7.6%. And even its unit costs have also not been devised. So we find that in respect of all the marginalized sections, there is not, they suffer from lack of attention and sensitivity, voicelessness, and which is reflected in inadequate resource flow and also adequate enforcement of their program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And let me now invite Dr. Indranil Mukhopadhyay, last but not the least, and you'll have the last word, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dhar. It was a great pleasure and honor to be part of this very distinguished panel, and I think we have heard a lot of things today from Professor Saxena, Professor Sharma, Professor Dhar himself, and Professor Mahajan. So I think and it has been long overshooting our time allotted. So I'll probably make one small remark and close this, and probably we should spend some time with questions and answers. One of the, if we look at, because a lot of things have been said about health sector already, about low allocations. I would like to highlight that the budget also shows a particular direction of the healthcare that the Union government is trying to push us towards, and that is it's not new. It has been there. Every year the Union government spends or cuts allocation on crucial schemes of primary care, scheme related to maternal and child health for the National Health Mission. I wanted to bring it here. If you look at allocations in real terms from the year 2016-17, virtually there is no increase over this entire period of time in allocation. But then at the same time, a large part of the scheme being demand driven, we see every year that in the revised estimate and in the actual allocations increase. So what is the problem if allocation ultimately expenditure is increasing? What is the problem? One may ask. I want to point out that this tendency of lower allocation and finally increased expenditure shows that there is a huge demand for such schemes. The fund absorption capacity of state governments have increased, and there is further need to expand primary care, secondary care to vehicles like NHM. We need not only for maternal and child health, but also whole range of communicable, non-communicable diseases. We need greater investment, and we have seen how the health sector has suffered in this period of time. So there is ample scope of improvement. The national mental health, the tele-mental health program has been mentioned, but let me point out within the National Health Mission, the budget allocated to national mental health program is 40 crore rupees, which is just rupees 30 per person per year. So, these issue has been raised repeatedly, but we need significant improvement in them. If we contrast this with the schemes that are incentivizing private sector in healthcare, the Prime Minister's Jan Arogya Yojana, the digital health mission, the Ayushman digital mission, we see significant jump in allocation. The Ayushman digital mission has got 560% increase in allocation at a time where our health sector needed basic infrastructure. And every year, the PMJY is unable to spend the budget it has been allocated. It spends only 30 to 40% of allocation, but then we see continuous the allocations are retained, and there is always hope that the private sector would step up and get the benefit of the scheme. But in the period of the crisis, we have seen how the private sector has failed. Now, but then what is the harm? The problem is the schemes, the components that could strengthen the health system. Those schemes are being neglected over the period. And for instance, the National Urban Health Mission is not receiving any significant allocation. And in the period of COVID, it has become very clear that primary care in urban areas are in a poor state, and we need to spend more resources to rebuild the primary care in urban area. And NHM, NUHM could have been the vehicle which could strengthen that. But unfortunately, there is no such push. Rather, there is a push for tertiarization of healthcare, which is very unfortunate. There is a lot said about health sector. One last point I want to say: NHM is also important because large part of the health workforce, which are women, particularly the frontline health workers, the ASHA workers, the ANMs, the Anganwadi workers, they are not even paid, particularly ASHAs and Anganwadi workers are not even paid minimum wages. And we need to bring their rights, their safety, their concerns at the forefront. And we need to increase allocation because most of these frontline workers are women, overwhelming majority of them are women. So we need to step up expenditure allocation in such schemes. I think I'll stop here and I would like to also probably hear the other participants who have been patiently hearing us for a long period of time. And thanks again for giving me this opportunity. And it has been a phenomenal learning experience hearing from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Indranil. Would have loved to hear you more. And thank you very much for considering the interests of the participants and allowing them to ask some questions. So now I'll open the floor for any questions or observations. Please keep your questions very limited, and even your observation should not be long, because as you can see, we have long overshot the time that we had at our disposal. So the floor is open. Please introduce yourself and direct your question to whichever panelist you want to answer. Thank you. You may raise your hand, in case anyone. I don't see any questions from anyone. So no one has any questions. I think the panelists have been convincing enough with their arguments, and there are no questions. So let me now try and conclude this meeting, and there is nothing much for me to actually summarize, because there's been such exhaustive presentations by each of the panelists. I would say that this was a really challenging budget at an extremely challenging juncture for the country, which Nitya mentioned at the beginning. This is an exceptional situation that we are in, and the government has tried to provide the stimulus, looking at the longer term, and as many of us mentioned, that increase in capital expenditure is something that is welcome. Certainly something that the country needs, and in the context of what Professor Atul Sharma said, that our capital investment has been coming down, and given that situation, we needed to do something. The government needed to reverse that situation, and it has done in a substantial manner. The only issue that many of us have been worried about is that is there enough for overcoming the crisis that we have today? And there is no doubt that we are still in the midst of the problem, and several sectors, as each one of the panelists mentioned, are really in a serious problem. The point that Professor Ashwini Mahajan made, that the government acts as a facilitator, that's a very important point that he made, and that is the reason why we feel that the budget making exercise is so very important. That the government has a significant role to play, and we've all along been pointing out that the entire neoliberal agenda will not take the country anywhere. The government has to be a very important player in this framework, and the fiscal policy of the government is extremely important to give direction to the economy. And that's the reason why many of us have been arguing that the stimulus that was provided in 2020, the fiscal component of that should have been much more, as compared to what the government thought, that pumping in money through the Reserve Bank. And so rather than going in for monetary policy solutions, fiscal policy was very important. This was something which even the IMF was emphasizing very strangely, that the importance of fiscal policy, which was done and was followed in many countries. So the government as a facilitator, and the finance minister has also mentioned that government spending, and the government spending on especially on on capital creation of more capital would draw in more private investment. So this whole crowding in the aspect that the finance minister mentioned, and Professor Ashwini Mahajan also indicated that. I think that's an important point, and we have seen it in the past also. That's the government gave tax breaks to the corporates, but we didn't see commensurate investment increase. Of course, immediately after that we had the pandemic. But the private sector always looks at the market conditions, and unless the demand conditions recover and become good enough for them to put in their money, they are not going to be forthcoming. And therefore, we felt that it was necessary for the government to take proactive measures to stimulate demand, and therefore the points that we all made about increasing NREGA spending, or even the National Food Security Act, where the poor would actually have some disposable income in order to create a certain amount of demand. So in the short run, all this is important, but in the longer run, again, I think every panelist mentioned about the importance of creating more jobs. And how do you create more jobs, and especially the challenges to create jobs in the in the informal economy, because the formal large corporates are not creating jobs. And how do you actually support jobs? How do you ensure that the MSME sector gets and the micro enterprises get back on track? And micro enterprises, all of us know that they don't get support from the formal financial the credit system. So what can be done about these smaller enterprises so that they can get up on their 2 feet? So these are some of the issues that we thought was important. And we will, I think finally I would say that we'll always remain a bit dissatisfied with the government does, because I think the expectations we have for this country and the younger people is sky high, especially after there was a report published by the World Economic Forum in their recent before the recent Davos meeting, which said that there are at least 5 major pain points that India faces, and one of them is youth hopelessness. And that's one issue that I think all of us are mindful of with the kind of job situation in this country, and therefore we would all expect that the government actually puts its best foot forward in order to get the country on a steady and a virtuous cycle. So with that, I would again, on behalf of all the panelists and my own self, like to thank CSD, Professor Muchkund Dubey, Professor Nityanand, and of course Akhil, for having us all here, and Akhil for facilitating this whole program. It's been wonderful. So I'd like to close the meeting here, and thank you very much, and hope to see you again in one of the future SDF meetings. Thank you very much. All the very best.
Thank you, sir. I join Professor Vishesh Dhar in extending a warm thanks on the behalf of SDF CSD to all of you who took out time from your busy schedule and enriched the discussion with your presentations and deliberations. We hope to see you and welcome you in our future programs as well. Thank you. Thank you very much.